Hi. In this video I'm going to discuss and throw a tumbler and talk about finishing the bottom a little bit without trimming. So I have this Josh DeWeese tumbler here, which is a good example of a very tall cup. It's much taller than it is wide, which is what I think of as a tumbler. It's a cup taller than it is wide, without a handle, with relatively thin walls, or even really thin walls, nice for cold beverages. And if you look at Josh DeWeese's tumbler here, the bottom has not been trimmed on the wheel. There's no foot ring, but it's still finished in a particular way. And I'm not going to talk about the glazing and things like that. I'm going to talk about how to create this form, or a tumbler form that doesn't have a trim bottom. Not this exact form, but it's a good example for us to refer to. So I'm going to start with throwing. So I'm going to start out with a little bit less than a pound of clay. This is about 3/4 of a pound. Round in the bottom so I don't trap any air. I'm going to place that on the wheel head, and I'm going to get my wheel going to a slow speed and pat it down to center so it's nice and adhered to the wheel head. This is a bit of a review for my basic cylinder video, because throwing lots of pottery form starts out as cylinders. This is just going to be a much smaller cylinder. So I'm going to get the wheel going a good speed, get some water on there, and I'm actually going to use a little bit of a different centering hand position than I had demonstrated before, because it's such a small amount of clay. It's hard for me to get my hands around it in the same way I did with 2 pounds of clay. So let me show you exactly what I'm doing. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of ways to hold your hands and to approach centering, but it all obeys the 4 keys, which is to keep your elbows in, apply pressure, hold steady, and ease off. I'm squeezing, pulling, and pushing down all at the same time. That's how I center small amounts of clay. But let me switch and force myself to do this other one, because it's just so small. You can also do this, which is pushing. So this works fine as well, especially if your hands are smaller or if you have a little more clay. You can see where the contact was. And then I'm going to do one more thing, which is to pull the clay up and push it down. So back to that first position where I'm squeezing the clay from the top side, and I'm squeezing in, and as I go up I pull it into more of a tower. This is a good way to center because it really gets the clay moving around. Generally makes it easier to pull up the wall if you do a centering move where you pull up and then push it back down. I like a cone shape to start with. And I'm going to ease off. It's real important to remember to ease off. So that's centered enough for me to move on to step 2, which is digging the well. A little bit of water here. Starting with my thumbs, I'll create a well. Go down about 1/2 inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch here. And then with the 2 fingers of my right hand and my thumb of my left hand, I'll go down. And I'm going to stop about halfway and ease off. And I'm going to switch. I have a little bit of a edge there that I'm going to push in gently. And this time, I'm going to finish with my 2 fingers. My left hand is anchored at 9 o'clock. I'm resting here, going back into the same position on the inside. But with my middle finger, I can dive down. And I want to go down until I'm about 1/4 inch from the wheel head. And I like to do it this way because this is a gauge for my 2 hands to talk to each other. The more you do it, the more you get a feel for that. So I'm more comfortable reaching the bottom like this than I am like this, because this is kind of floating in air. This is a little more anchored for me. So that's why I switched to that position. And if you're in doubt, you want to poke it with the needle tool to check the bottom thickness. So it's about 1/4 inch, which is good. I'm not going to trim the bottom, so I don't want a lot of extra clay down there. And I'm going to compress it. It'll probably get thinner than 1/4 inch in the end. And get the wheel speed back, and I'm ready for step number 3, which is to create and compress the floor. Same hand position that I was just using. I'm going to pull towards 6 o'clock. and really exaggerate a corner. I want a nice tall tumbler, so it's important for me not to stretch this too wide. I'd have to really collar it in. So I stretched it out, but not too wide, and I'm going to go back in and really compress the floor with my fingertips back and forth. If there's any bumps, thick spots. Do that a few times. All right, now I'm ready to do a preliminary pull. So I like to get my fingertips back in there in the same hand position that I just ended with. I'm really in the corner. Once I lock in, I'll bring both hands up together. And that begins the process of pulling the clay from the bottom up to the top. I want to think about the fact that I really want this thing to be tall, so I'm even going to collar in at this early stage. So I'm taking two hands here on the outside and I'm tucking the clay inward, so it's more of a cone and a little narrower at the top. Now I'm ready to pull up the wall, step 4. This is where you have to obey the rule, which is your left hand on the inside, right hand on the outside, working at 3 or 4 o'clock. Now, on a smaller piece, I like to put 2 fingers inside, so my middle finger's in the corner. My my left index finger comes out, as well as my pinky. That's what's comfortable for me, but it's not a rule. You could do it like that, but I'm more comfortable like this, and that allows these to touch and brace each other. But the pressure will be on my outside right middle finger and my inside left middle finger. That's where most of the pressure is going to be. The rest of the fingers are there for support. So I'm going medium speed, and I create a lump by pressing out with my inside finger, and I catch the lump on the outside with my right middle finger. And I'm working my way up. And it's good if I can keep going inward a little bit so it doesn't flare out. And I'm going to go all the way through the top this time, because a tumbler shouldn't have a really thick lip, and I don't want too much extra clay up there, so I'm going to try to pull it up through the entire wall each time. So there was one pull. Get a little bit of water in there. I'm going to do the next pull with a sponge in my outside hand, which I tend to like to switch to after maybe the first or second pull. So here we go. We're going to do the same thing. Left hand on the inside, right hand on the outside. Working at 4 o'clock. Create a lump and catch the lump on the outside. And work your way all the way up through the wall. And it's very important to ease off. Release your pressure gently, whatever you do on the wheel. So we have kind of a short squat cup form. Right now it looks more like a mug than a tumbler. And we still got a ways to go. But at this stage, I'm going to take a look at what I'm doing here and get rid of some extra water that was in there. It's good not to let that sit there. And I'm going to use the sponge, get the outside nice and slippery, and I'm going to do a gentle collaring move to help it stay narrow. But it's not the final move. I'm going to pull the wall up one more time. And I even collared in the very bottom a little bit. And you can see the clay is deforming around my hands, but by the time I get up to the top, I'll gently let go, and so it stays nice and round. And then this time, I'm going to do a pull, and I'm going to see how far my fingers reach. So my fingers reach to the bottom. When I pull this up, I'm not going to be able to reach the bottom again easily. So I'd like to do a real good pull here so I don't have to go back in there. The bottom flares out a little bit. I want it to be tapered the opposite direction in the end. So I'm going to apply a little more pressure from the outside, pushing in, and hopefully this will go well. And so I'm going a little bit fast. Slow down the wheel a little bit. When the wall gets thinner, you want to slow your wheel down a little bit. I was kicking the wheel when I didn't need to. So I'm going to start at the bottom and press in to narrow that base a little bit. Now you'll see a big lump, and I'm going to try to pull that clay that I pushed up towards the top. And I go all the way up through the top. And now it's starting to get a little bit more of that taper. It's not quite as tall as I was going for. It might not be, definitely not going to be as tall as the demonstration cup I showed you, Josh DeWeese's, but I want proportions to be a little bit narrower and taller, so I'm going to do that by collaring. I have water in there, and this is a good time for me to get it out before I make it too narrow. So I'm using the sponge and my fingers and getting a little bit of water out of there one more time. Now I'm going to show one thing, which is an optional move, which is to use a stick. This is a paint stirring stick. You can also use a nice one from the ceramic supply store, but I'm going to show it with something as simple as a paint stick to go in there and compress the bottom and dry it out even better. And so the way to do that is to hold the stick with two hands at a little bit of a backward angle. So I'm not going straight, I'm going like this, and I just go in there and I can go down into the floor there, and I can flatten it out if I had some irregularities, and I can scrape away a little bit of clay if it's too thick and go back and forth, and this really helps compress, and it takes away the slip that was in there, and that makes a nice compressed floor, nice and flat. So now I'm ready to collar in. Start with the sponge to make sure that there's no dry spots out there. And I'm going to even more water on there. Medium speed, starting at the very bottom. I can bring the bottom in a little bit, and I need to hold real stable because it might throw it off center a little bit. Now I'm going to come up, and as I go up, I'm going to gently allow my hands to open up a little bit. I don't want to collar it too much. I want it to be tapered as a finished shape. So now the bottom has a little bit of a bell bottom to it, but it's a nice taper from that point upwards, kind of what I was going for. I can look in there. The stick can come in handy to help shape the inside of the wall a little bit. So I'm going to go in there and just get rid of that bell just a little bit. I don't need to do anything major because the basic shape is good, but it pressed it out a little bit right there. Now I'm going to use my throwing stick. Uh-oh. Right here, I found it. And I'm going to cut away the rest of that bell, or at least most of it. So I don't want too much of a bell bottom. So here is trimming off, and this helps remove excess weight because remember, I'm not going to trim this. So I trim that off now with a wooden tool. It's best to stop the wheel here and just kick it slowly to remove that ring of clay, like that. So now I can kind of see my form. It's looking more what I wanted, which was a tumbler taller than it is wide with a taper going up. So now I just need to do the finishing touches, which are get the wall the way I want it to look and to finish the lip. And so it looks a little bit machined right now, a little bit straight, doesn't have much gesture to it. I'm going to take a sponge and go gently on the inside wall because it's really dry. I'm going to put my hand back on the inside. It's like I'm going to do a pole, but I'm not trying to thin the wall out a lot. I just want to give it some gesture, some movement based on the marks of the sponge in my hand. So my hand's on the inside, the sponge on the outside. I'm starting here at the bottom, and I'm going to apply a little pressure with my finger, and I'm going to work my way up like much faster than I normally do for pulling up the wall. And hopefully that'll give it a little bit of personality. It doesn't look so machined or dry. And so that was okay. A little bit of marks on the inside I don't like, so I'm going to gently sponge them away. And then the last thing, two things I need to do is finish the very top and the very bottom. And we'll pull it off the wheel. To finish the lip, I'm going to use a chamois, a little strip of soft leather that's been soaking in water, so it's really damp. And you don't want it to be dripping wet, just really nice and soft. And hold that between both of your fingertips there and hold it taut. Bring it in a little bit closer. And then as soon as it contacts, then you want to loosen it up. So you don't hold it really flat as soon as it contacts. I can take my fingertips and go on either side of that, and I can kind of shape the lip to how I like it. So for a tumbler, I don't want a big thick lip on the top. I want it to be a little bit thinned out at the very, very top edge. But by doing what I just did, it's actually thicker just below the top, which makes a much stronger cup. So there's a lot of ways to create lips, and sometimes you think you made a great one and then you go to use it and it's not so great, and sometimes vice versa, but that's a pretty tried and true way to do it with the chamois. And then the very last thing I'm going to do before I take it off the wheel is work on the very, very bottom a little bit with the wooden knife. So I did this once before to get my shape, but this is the finishing touches here. So I can trim off more if I don't like it, but I'm just going to clean it up a little bit. Now, taking the point and going directly in, I can create a little bit of a shadow there. And sometimes the clay will roll up into a little foot. You can intentionally do that a lot more with certain tools or positions, but it kind of naturally happens if you just cut away a little bit at the bottom, and that can be a good spot for the glaze to stop, and it does finish the form a little bit more than it just going straight into the table. Okay, I'm ready to pull this off the wheel. I'm going to clean the slip off of my hands because I'm going to lift it off the wheel as opposed to slide it. For a tall form like this that's pretty thin, I prefer to lift them off for a couple reasons. If it's real thin and you slide it, you're going to mess it up. And I actually like the little bit of softness created by lifting it off the wheel. So I used my wire tool there and I spun the wheel slowly and pulled it through. Now I can lift it off by shaping my hands into the shape of the cup. So I shape them like that, hold it like an extremely ripe tomato, and hold it up like that, and then come over to wherever you're putting it and gently rest it down there, and it leaves slip marks and a little irregularity from doing so. If you really don't want that, later when it's set up a little bit, you can push and smooth those out, but generally I'll just leave them. And as you can see on the board there is a cup that's in the leather hard stage. That's a similar form, a little bit taller and straighter. And I want to show the final steps for the bottom. If you're not going to trim the bottom, which you don't have to on these type of forms, they don't really require a trimmed foot. Some do have them, but this one is not going to have it. I don't want to leave that real sharp there. You can see how I created that little bit of a ledge there, just the same way I did on that with the wooden knife when I threw it, but there's some irregularities. All you need to do is just run your finger around that. Don't get a lot of water on there. Sometimes one drop of water might be helpful, but don't overdo it with water because you'll make it really rough. And so just soften the very edge so you don't have any sharp edges. So there's really not much to that. And then push the bottom in a little bit. If you leave it totally flat, there's a chance as it dries it'll actually go the other way, and then your cup won't sit flat on the table. And it's always stronger if the flat piece of clay has a little curve to it, so you want that curve to go in. So the way to do it is just to play the drum. Just hit it with your fingertips or your hand ever so slightly so that it is curved inwards, so it's concave. So it's at the leather hard stage, and so before I fire this, I want to sign it, and you got a nice big surface to sign there, and a good way to sign pots is to use a dull pencil as opposed to a needle tool. It's not as scratchy, and so I'll just put my name on there. So I sign that, and all of those things, I just leave them. If I try to clean them off, it might make it messier. After it's fired, you just come off in a second, or even when it's bone dry before it's fired, you can knock them off, but don't do it now because you'll make it messy. So those are finished, or that one's finished, and I'll have to wait for the other one to get leather hard and finish it later. Okay, thanks.